few things for you to be aware of in regards to our chat panels. We do have 3 chat panels working today. Please use the technical chat panel if you encounter any sound issues. I will work as quickly as possible to try and resolve these for you. Our second chat panel is for group questions and comments. This is really just a chat panel for you all to put any comments or ask any questions which you as the group can correspond through and answer within. Our third and most important chat panel is the questions for Richard and Jodie chat panel. As we said, the purpose of this presentation is to answer any questions you have. So to enable Jodie and Richard to do so, please type succinct one-line questions if possible into this panel. They will make every attempt to answer these questions, but if it is not possible, they will review post-webinar and will either come back to you directly or we will add them to the FAQs page on the licensing portion in our website. We'll show you the links for these after the presentation. So great to have you on board, and what I'd like to now do is to just hand over to Richard and Jodie to get underway, so thank you.
Kia ora, good morning and welcome to this Te Ao Rangahau discussion on occupational regulation. I'm Richard Templar, the Chief Executive of Te Ao Rangahau Engineering New Zealand, and with me, but not in shot at the moment, is Jodie Corley, our Policy and Projects Lead. And when we get to the question and answer stage, you'll see both of us. Thank you for joining us today as we discuss the proposal from the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment on occupational regulation. This is a big proposal and has the potential to impact every one of our members. It's also the third time MBIE has consulted on regulating engineering as a profession. We appreciate you joining us for this session. So some housekeeping points just to reiterate what Leanne said. There are 3 boxes for you to type in. The technical issues only is just for that, if you had any technical issues. The group comments and questions is for you to make any comments you wish, but which you don't require a specific answer from us. And then the questions for Richard and Jodie, fairly self-explanatory. Those are the questions we will try and answer later in the session. If you can, please keep your questions reasonably short and to the point, and we'll do our best to get through as many as we can. At the end of our presentation, there'll be some next steps, which is how we want you to continue to be involved in the conversation, and we would like you to provide feedback to MBIE. And we're also asking for your feedback to us on our draft thoughts. So thank you very much. There is currently the case for change. There's currently no requirement for engineers in New Zealand to be registered. This means anyone can call themselves an engineer. It also means there's no way to hold individuals doing engineering to work to account for professional misconduct. This isn't ideal, and by that we mean there isn't a universal way of doing it. The tragedy of the CTV building is one example of the system not working. That tragedy has cast a long shadow on the profession over 10 years. Effective occupational regulation lifts professional standards, sets clear expectations around competencies and qualifications required to perform certain work, particularly life safety work, gives assurance to the public that they're engaging the right people for the job, and allows individual engineers to be held to account for professional misconduct. The work engineers do is important and has consequences for the public. It is for this reason we support MBIE's case for change. Here is a quote directly from MBIE on the case for change. While many of New Zealand's engineers are highly professional, our system for regulating the profession is flawed. Too many engineers operate outside of a regulatory regime. It is hard to hold engineers to account when standards slip, and there is no means of ensuring engineers who practice in particularly high-risk fields are competent. Occupational regulation will not address all the issues of quality we see across the industries you work in. Issues of quality will still occur even within regulated occupations. However, occupational regulation is one lever of many that governments can use to strengthen the system that engineers work within, to better assure competence and accountability. Engineering New Zealand supports the occupational regulation of engineers. Overall, we support MBIE's proposals. It's our view that MBIE's proposals will enhance public safety and the profession's public reputation. So, our principles. We've been talking about occupational regulation for engineers for some time now. Our principles for this work remain the same. They're based on the feedback you have given us on several different occasions. It is our view that the regulatory framework should be simple and easy to operate, pitch government oversight at the right level, and work for the whole profession. With that in mind, let's look at the proposals and Engineering New Zealand's views. So what is MBIE proposing? Well, the proposal is quite large, and it's easy to dive down into the detailed bits of the proposals and potentially run the risk of losing sight of the big picture and the key questions. For the purposes of this presentation, we're focusing at the big picture level. The key aim of MBIE's proposals is to set up the framework to regulate engineers. They want to get this framework into legislation. They need to get the framework right, and this framework involves three things: registration, licensing, and system change. We'll now go through each one of these, outlining MBIE's position and our intended response. Registration. The first key proposal is the registration of all professional engineers. Here's another quote from MBIE's consultation document. Under this proposal, all persons providing professional engineering services would need to be registered. This would include engineers working in the major disciplines of chemical, civil, electrical and mechanical engineering and their sub-branches. The key point in MBIE's proposal for registration is they're proposing widespread mandatory registration of anyone providing professional engineering services. This is a significant change from MBIE's previous proposals, which were an optional certification scheme. It also reflects feedback we've been provided about any regulatory framework for engineers needing to extend beyond the building and construction sector. The proposal aims to bring all professional engineers into a regulatory framework and represents a significant change for our profession. One thing the proposal has created some confusion over is MBIE's intention with respect to computer system and software engineering. Given MBIE's framing of the proposal as relating to all persons providing professional engineering services, we'd interpret the list of disciplines mentioned as an intent to be inclusive of all parts of the profession, rather than a deliberate move to exclude certain disciplines or sub-disciplines. Since our last discussion session, we've discussed this with MBIE. We now understand that MBIE intentionally did not include software IT engineering, but are looking for feedback on whether or not this is appropriate. What is a professional engineer? MBIE is proposing to use this definition to identify who needs to be registered. The definition is very broad, and they recognise this. Here's how MBIE has defined a professional engineer. Any person who provides professional engineering services. By this we mean any act of planning, designing, composing, evaluating, advising, reporting, directing, supervising or managing that requires the application of engineering principles and judgment and concerns the safeguarding of life, health, property, economic interests, the public welfare or the environment. Other professions would fall under this definition, as could engineering technologists, engineering technicians and engineering geologists. MBIE is looking for feedback on this definition, and we're keen to hear your thoughts on this too. So we would be keen to know, for example, whether you think IT engineers in terms of computer systems and software should be included, and also whether you think this definition is workable and useful. Putting a ring around professional engineering work is not easy, and it's likely that any definition will require interpretation and judgment. We've spoken with Engineers Canada recently, recognising that Canada has legislation that restricts engineering work and protects the title engineer. The definition of engineering in Canada is similarly broad, but they tell us that in practice, most of the compliance actions that are taken by the regulator tend to relate to the right to title breaches, using the term engineer without a licence rather than right to practice breaches, undertaking engineering work without a licence. Level of registration. A key question for MB and for us is at what level should registration be set? Should new graduates be registered and called professional engineers, or should engineers be required to take professional training to be registered? Or should they be required to demonstrate a level of professional competence aligning with taking responsibility or signing off work? We're hearing a lot from members about the level or standard for registration. Our sense right now is that most members support wide inclusion in the regulatory regime. This means there is wide support for the entry of professional engineers into the register very early in their career. This is a significant difference from chartership, which is an assessment of competency to an internationally benchmarked standard, typically after at least 4 to 5 years standard. 4 to 5 years work. Our view. At this point in time, our view is that we support mandatory registration, and we're working to understand where the bar for registration should be. We think it is somewhere between requiring new graduates to take a professional training program and the current chartership level. Key perspectives that we're trying to balance here, in addition to the principles already mentioned, simplicity, right touch, inclusive, etc., include potential advantages of getting all engineers inside the tent, committed to a code of ethics and subject to an accountability regime. The level of assurance that registration could be expected to provide to members of the public or other regulators, particularly in the fields of engineering not requiring a licence. How best to move building control authorities, local councils, away from maintaining their own lists of competent people for consenting work outside of licensing classes. And of course, international mobility and mutual recognition issues. Registration early career is generally not consistent with models overseas. So how would we go about registering an engineer who came to New Zealand, and what would a register engineer, if they travelled overseas, expect that to mean for them? If we are to argue for mandatory registration after some form of professional training or formation, we're wondering about whether an engineer in training designation, as used in several overseas jurisdictions, including Canada and South Africa, might give us the best of both worlds. We want your views on this, and we'll pose a specific question for you late in the session, so we keep thinking about that during the discussion. The licensing. MBIE's second major proposal has to do with the licensing of high-risk engineering disciplines. To quote from the consultation document, which summarises MBIE's intent, we propose to set up a framework to restrict certain engineering practice fields to engineers licensed in that field. This would ensure that only competent practitioners with relevant experience could provide that engineering services. In broad terms, this is consistent with the proposals MBIE has consulted on in 2019. Key thing to note about MBIE's licensing proposal is that they have not yet sorted out what disciplines will require a license. This will be decided by the regulator. What we need to focus on right now is whether licensing is a good idea. Our position on licensing is not new. In our submission on the 2019 proposals and through all our occupational regulation and CPench work, we've supported the introduction of licenses. We see this as consistent with specialist registration classes in overseas jurisdictions, such as the structural engineer license in the US and other professions in New Zealand, such as medicine, which have significant life safety consequences. We also support MBIE's proposals to leave the framing of particular licence classes to the regulator and welcome the scope for licensing to extend beyond building and construction, which was the focus of their 2019 proposals. System. MBIE's final proposal focused on the structure of the system going forward. As we mentioned at the start, MBIE's consultation is looking at getting the framework of the regulatory system right. They are looking for feedback on how this will work best and who should do what. Here is a significantly simplified diagram of what MBIE is proposing. We've tried to make it as straightforward as possible. MBIE is looking to establish a regulator that reports directly to a Minister of the Crown. This regulator will be independent of Engineering New Zealand and the profession. The regulator board will be appointed by the Minister. This is a very common regulatory model for professional regulation. In other professions, this board is made up predominantly of the professionals it regulates, but there may be other people on the board as well. MBIE are then proposing that Engineering New Zealand act as the regulatory service provider. The proposal is that this provider would manage both the general registration and licence registers. Our view. We support MBIE's proposals on the system structure. We know there will be a lot of work ahead, but we agree with MBIE that we are the best place to be the service provider. We think this model balances perceptions of conflict of interest while maximising operational efficiencies between regulatory and professional body functions. It's worth noting that in our review of CPENG, we are looking to separate the Registration Authorities Board from the Board of Engineering New Zealand over the next 18 to 24 months anyway. So we are already heading in this direction. Righto, question and answer time. So Jodie and I will move so that we are.
Kia ora koutou. My name is Jodie again. I'm the Policy and Projects Lead here at Engineering New Zealand. And we'll just go through some of the questions you've asked, and please keep typing your questions. Thanks for engaging in this way with us. So I believe the first one was from Andrew, and it said, I'm concerned more regulations will make engineers less likely to become registered or licensed. Has this been considered?
So MBIE has thought about this, so hence their move to essentially make it compulsory. So if you want to call yourself a professional engineer, if you want to undertake professional engineering services and practice, you will need to be a registered engineer. In terms of licensing, if you want to undertake particular life safety work, you will need to be licensed.
Thanks, Richard. The next question is about sole operators. It seems that this proposal is aiming at sole operators, but what about those that are working in large companies or firms?
So there would still be the requirement that those engineers be registered, and if there were a group of engineers working on one project, I mean, in terms of accountability, where you have a project with multiple registered engineers involved and something goes wrong, then essentially you will have collective accountability. You may get the situation where there is a particular engineer in charge where the accountability sits with them, but provided everyone's doing their job well, this shouldn't be an issue.
Sherry also asks about the engineering training being somewhere between graduation and licensing. And she mentions, oh, sorry, it's just popped off my screen. She mentions that engineers, uni doesn't give you enough practical exposure to professional engineering, and that's our thoughts as well. Would you like to elaborate on that, Richard?
Yeah, certainly the conversations we've had with university academics, including we have two very senior academics on our board. Their view is that, yes, you've done the academic training, but you haven't had the practical experience necessary to be a professional engineer. So they don't think the idea that you become a professional engineer on graduation is the right way to go.
Just a gentle reminder, if you have specific questions, if you could leave them in this question chat box, but if you have some general comments, if you could move those comments to the group the group chat that's, I believe, just beside on your screen, just so we can easily peruse your questions. Richard, I wonder if you could talk about the transition. MB's mentioned quite a long transition period. Obviously, this is a significant change for the profession and for us as Engineering New Zealand. Can you talk about your thinking around that transition?
So our expectation is that any transition would be probably over the course of at least 5 years after the legislation is enacted. So in order to make these changes, MB will need to introduce legislation that will need to be passed, that will set up both registration and licensing. There would then be basically a transition, which would mean basically chartered professional engineers would be transferred into the licensing system, because you've got to create a transition to ensure you don't create a situation where no one can sign off the construction of large buildings or large dams or something like that. And then once the licensing regime gets up to speed and gets running, then those engineers would be assessed after a period of time. But it's going to be years rather than months, and it's probably a minimum of 5 years transition to start with.
And can you talk about CPEng in that process and what we're thinking about CPEng and what will happen to CPEng in that transition?
So one of the things we're working on at the moment is basically raising the bar for CPEng and also making it more efficient. We're going to continue doing that. It's going to continue to be important for people to become CPEng, because as you transition into the licensing regime, being a CPEng will make that transition as easy as possible. And then once the licensing regime is fully up and running, everyone from CPEng should transfer into that, and then their competency will be assessed. What we haven't determined yet is whether we will continue with a sort of chartered membership, whether that's sort of a third tier, so registration, chartered membership and licensing. That's something to work through in the future.
Thanks, Richard. Sheree asked about being licensed and what will be the measure of people being worthy to be licensed. And maybe I could talk to that point. So we're just working through some advice on that. Obviously, a lot of this work is still to come. There's a lot of work it's going to come after the framework's developed. But our view right now is that any license categories need to be developed very clearly with the technical societies or the engineering associations best placed to look at how we do that. And any requirements for getting a license will need to be worked through in time with the regulator and with those technical societies or engineering associations. So the next question here is, what will be the impact on overseas-based learned societies or institutions? So what about some of those international agreements we have?
So it's extremely important for us to continue to regard engineering as an international profession. So through things like the Washington Accord, it means engineering degrees in, I think, 88 countries have equivalents. So whatever we do in terms of registration and licensing, we're going to need to look to establish the international equivalents for people coming into New Zealand and for New Zealand engineers going overseas. The good thing is, because we're extremely well connected in these networks and host them, we already have mechanisms to work our way through this. So it's part of the capability Engineering New Zealand has.
Thanks, Richard. Marie agrees with the principles being proposed as being positive and supportive. And you mentioned, as we have, that the devil is really in the detail to come. But you also ask about Engineering New Zealand transitioning from what we are doing currently around competency-based assessments to the new regime. So maybe, Richard, you could add a bit more about your thinking on our transition processes.
So the question there is, at the moment, would be around registration. So how would you go about registration? It all depends on where the level of registration is. Obviously, if MB decide that it is set upon graduation, then the typical way you might register software or ICT engineering would be, say, you have to have completed an equivalent to a 4-year Washington Accord degree, have passed that, have signed up for the Code of Conduct and committed to continuous professional development and demonstrated that. So that's kind of at the low end. So there isn't a particular judgment there. And then we'd have an alternative pathway for people who have, say, done a 3-year degree and then worked to gain equivalent experience. If it is set at a higher level, that is something we'll have to work out how we do across all engineering disciplines. And it might be something that says, basically, if you have worked for 3 to 4 years, demonstrated success in projects, demonstrated that you haven't breached the code of conduct, that you have been ethical in your behaviour, and you have committed to professional development and are able to show that, then you are registered. So it's different from sort of at a licensing level where you have to do something to an even higher level than probably CPEng, which is demonstrate significant projects, a very high level of competence, and essentially be assessed to determine that competence is accurate.
Thanks, Richard. Now, either I'm not seeing them or the questions are still coming. I wonder if you could talk about our views and thinking about professional engineers, so those holding a 4-year Washington Accord degree, and then the role of engineering technicians, technologists, and engineering geologists in this scheme.
Yeah, so our view is that those professions should be registered, but probably in separate registers. So you'd have professional engineers who have completed a 4-year Washington Accord degree, engineering geologists, engineering technicians, that they should be registered as well, but that the registers should be separate. But also recognising that sometimes people who have those qualifications go on to work as professional engineer, so we'll need alternative pathways for people to get to that.
Thank you. Just looking at Peter's question, are the licensing regimes likely to be similar to how Engineering New Zealand operates today in terms of practice area? Given the relatively small size of the New Zealand market, we find people work in a number of practice areas. Can you talk about some of the thinking around that, Richard? So
the licensing areas are likely to be significantly more narrow than at a discipline level. So they'll be, might be specifically around structural engineering, might be fire engineering, might be geotechnical, might be, large dams or something like that. And yes, it is highly likely that some people will need multiple licenses, because some people will do structural engineering work and fire safety engineering, or structural and geotech or something like that, or geotech and large dam design, in which case people will need multiple licenses.
And one thing we're working through in this proposal and how we respond to MB is working through the compliance costs to industry. So we're working on that with ACE New Zealand. So thinking about how would this look in practice? How would our recommendations work in practice? And what might the costs look like? Both the compliance costs to join the scheme, to run the scheme. Right now we rely on a lot of goodwill from the profession to assess CPEng and chartered membership. So what is the cost in that area? And then also what is the impact on liability and insurance markets? So we're working through that with ACE New Zealand, and we're hoping together to kind of form a view on that in this process, but we'll keep up that conversation. Now, I think I've got to Ken.
I can answer this one. So Ken, when we talk about the 3 things in the proposal, those are the 3 things in the MB proposal. So proposal 1, establish a new registration requirement. That's when we're talking about registration. Proposal 2, restrict who can carry out. That's the licensing part of the proposal. And 3, establish a 2-tier regulator. That is the system. So we have in fact covered all 3 of those parts over.
So we're just looking at the last question.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. How can we stop someone from being able to work as a professional engineer if registration is not mandatory and universal? So that's the issue we have at the moment. There is no mechanism to stop someone working as a professional engineer. So we don't have that ability either as Engineering New Zealand, nor does MB have that. So it's only universal registration, and all that would happen is someone would be deregistered and therefore not able to use the title professional engineer. It wouldn't necessarily stop them, carrying out work. They just couldn't do it as a professional engineer. And we would hope that public and other agencies would choose not to work with that person.
Thanks, Richard. I just want to add a little bit to that. one of the things we're thinking about in terms of should it be mandatory and universal is there other areas where exceptions are appropriate. So areas with very tight regulatory systems already around them. Aviation is one, research and development is another. So we're just thinking about, should we recommend it be universal, or should we recommend it be generally widespread and mandatory with some exceptions? So your comments and feedback on that would be really appreciated, because we're grappling with that question. So I think we're down to, sorry, we've lost the train.
So there's actually a question in the group questions and comments. We use overseas engineers with design for design plant installations and commissioning in New Zealand. How will this be impacted? So it shouldn't change. You should be able to use international engineers, because this is all about the regulation of New Zealand engineers. It's not about the regulation of international engineers. However, there will be an expectation of professionalism and standards on whoever is commissioning the plant in New Zealand if they are a New Zealand engineer.
Thank you, Richard. Murray, I'm sorry that we missed your earlier question. You've asked about the regulatory board ensuring that there's representation across engineering. If I'm understanding that correctly, how does this ensure that all disciplines are covered by the regulatory board, as the minister cannot operate outside his or her area of responsibility? That's a very good question, Murray. Thanks for that.
And happy to answer that. Of course, what would happen is the minister would essentially be given the powers to regulate engineers. So that means once that minister is given that power, they can operate well outside building and construction. Because just as the building and construction minister holds other portfolios, as you'll be aware, ministers typically hold multiple portfolios and they work within those portfolios. So in this case, it would potentially be the Minister of Building and Construction. And bear in mind that would be in this term, it doesn't mean that it would necessarily be the Minister of Building and Construction always going forward. But in this case, this is being what proposed. But once the minister is given that power, they automatically have the power to regulate all engineers.
One thing to note in there is that a lot of work going through Cabinet right now is talking about the occupational regulation of engineers. So in the dam safety work that's going on, also in the water space, there's quite a lot of commentary going through government about how to regulate professionals in these areas. So MBIE is trying to be broad and to be wide in how they're viewing this. Now, someone's mentioned, Murray's also mentioned about the Waikato DHV system and with the IT failures. Does this situation require licensing?
So I think that's an interesting question. I mean, I personally have a strong view that any registration should cover all engineers. I also think when you're looking at life safety work, it is very easy to through multiple ways, demonstrates where software engineering can have a direct life safety impact. If it's part of medical devices, or even, classic example, it's a software engineer will have designed the system that controls the traffic lights in any urban area, and that has direct life safety implications. So I think I like the proposal that MBIE is putting forward, that the regulator is going to have to work through this rather than try and address it in legislation, because I think that would be too hard.
Thanks, Richard. There's been a question, I think it's Ken, talking about the overseas registration and how that would apply to New Zealand. Just summarising your question, Ken, so let me know if I haven't captured that correctly. But can you talk about that cross-registration? I know you've mentioned it a little bit, but a lot of work will be coming in that space.
Yeah, so the key thing is if an engineer comes into New Zealand from overseas, so we bring them in to work on a project, is how do we ensure that they can seamlessly be registered if they meet the appropriate standard. And so that's essentially a matter of equivalence. So we already have the ability to do that for all qualifications. So all engineering qualifications, we know how to do the equivalence. It will be a matter of saying, okay, you've done X number of years and you've done this. Okay, you're considered registered, and away we go. So it'll be I'd say 99% of the time it'll be straightforward, and then there'll be a small amount of judgment required in the 1% of the time where someone has, just something slightly different from the norm.
Yeah. Sherry is asking about that ministerial portfolio and the building and construction, and maybe I can talk to this a little bit. This is something that we are considering and we have thought about. One thing to note about the ministerial portfolios is that the minister will be looking to ensure that the regulator is doing their job as per the legislation. So they're not looking at the individual detail of disciplines and the industries. They're looking at whether this regulator is performing to its requirements. So that's something to keep in mind. But like you said, Cherie, we are thinking about that as well. Where does this sit in the broader system? So just moving down to Catherine's question. I have a license from the country I come from, and when I registered in NZ, I was considered to be a member only and not a chartered member. How this MBIE will affect civil engineers like me? I have already 6 years of experience working in New Zealand.
And so that comes down to basically the way the system is set up at the moment. You would have to apply to be a chartered professional engineer, and your license and previous experience would form part of that process. And it's basically a side effect of the way the system is set up under legislation and practice now. In the future, hopefully we can have a more efficient process where we can look at if you are licensed overseas, and if that license is to the same standard or equivalent standard as New Zealand, it should be able to transfer straight across. And that's one of the things we're really keen to see incorporated in whatever legislation MBIE puts together, or at least give that ability to the registration authority.
Yeah, a lot of that detail is still to come, isn't it, as we work through and with the technical societies and engineering associations. Engineering New Zealand's presentation on revamping CPEng included a wish to include non-practicing engineers of CPEng, academics not involved in design. Has MBIE's proposal changed this view? That's a very good question, Andrew.
So the desire there was for people to be chartered rather than the CPEng, so chartered being slightly different. The short answer is yes, MBIE's proposal has changed this view. It's meant that we are still supportive of people getting chartered membership, but in terms of where we go with that in the future, we're going to have to reevaluate that in context of the final proposal from MBIE, because MBIE is essentially proposing a two-tier system, which is licensing at the top, registration at the bottom, and the open question for Engineering New Zealand is, do we want to introduce a tier in between those two? And that's something we'll be seeking your feedback on, and it's something we'll be working through.
Thanks, Richard. Stephen asked about the case for change and the numbers of failures that are being observed and people practicing outside professional scope and that sort of thing. Can you comment on your thoughts on that and just reiterate that kind of case for change and where we're seeing failures?
So we receive somewhere between 40 to 50 complaints around engineering lack of performance, I guess you could say, a year, and they range between the relatively minor, someone didn't like the way the engineer talked to them or communicated them, through to really significant failure of engineering practice, where design has been faulty, peer review has missed it, and any checks and balances have not occurred. And there are some very high-profile cases, predominantly in the building and construction space, but also in, say, the heavy transport space, which has received a lot of publicity. And because the risks are to life safety, but also fixing these mistakes typically costs hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in these cases, kind of any of these things occurring is too many, but there are just too many out there. And that's why MBIE has a desire to fix the system, and that's why we support them fixing the system.
Richard, can you comment comment on what kind of level in the system you're seeing failures?
Yeah, I think that's very true. These failures are typically not with graduate engineers or with junior engineers. They're typically failures that are occurring at either very experienced or in many cases CP engineers in terms of a structural sense or well qualified in the sort of heavy vehicle engineering. And that does pose significant challenges to our current system in terms of why is this occurring and why does it continue to occur. So that's why for us we think the licensing approach is good, because that lifts the standard and also means people will need to stay current.
Thank you, Richard. Now, Andrew's just put in a question about why would a third person be needed when Engineering New Zealand membership is can still be on. Sorry, Richard, Andrew, I'm just interpreting your question. Maybe Richard, you could talk about the interface with membership and this new proposal.
So probably 2 points to that. Yeah, the question as to whether we should have a third tier and the risk of it muddying the waters is something we're acutely aware of. So, that's something we have to think more about. In terms of the relationship between membership and registration, registration will be mandatory, membership will be not. But obviously being a member of Engineering New Zealand is a very good way to demonstrate your commitment to a code of conduct, to continuous professional development, and to a desire to work and support the profession. So it will lead to significant changes, but obviously membership of Engineering New Zealand delivers a whole lot of benefits, not least being you have a peak body that can actually engage with MBIE when issues like this come up.
I think we're catching up on the questions, and I wonder, Richard, if you could talk a little bit about those lines of where we're thinking registration should sit at. There's been a lot of conversation in this space, so a lot of conversation of should we include everyone, including new graduates? Should it be at the current CPEng, after a few years of experience and ability to do complex work, or should it be after a professional course? So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
So if we look at the different levels where people could be registered, at the base level, it is basically congratulations, you've completed your engineering degree and you're working as an engineer, so you need to get registered. The advantage with that is it's very unambiguous. It is clear when you need to be registered, and it's completely universal. Anyone who is actually practicing, working as an engineer would need to get registered. The next step is to go through something similar to, say, the legal profession, where you go through what's called a professionals course. So that might be somewhere between 3 to 6 months, where you do further work on basically professional skills, code of ethics, understanding of professional development, and understanding the role of the engineer in society and that sort of thing. And then after that 6 months period, you sit an exam or a test of some sort. So in a legal sense, that's exactly what happens. And then in the legal context, you are admitted to the bar. In an engineering context, you would then be registered and considered, I would call yourself a professional engineer. And then the sort of third level is to push up more towards where we're talking a chartered member or a certified professional engineer, which is after somewhere between 3 to 5 years professionally experience. Your competency can be assessed, and having been through a competency assessment process, you're registered, which means everyone agrees that you are capable of independent decision making. So you can be the final decision maker on an engineering project. And that is typically the sort of time frame at which people are moving from being a member of a team and having another engineer, assess and make sure they're doing a good job, to leading teams and being the key decision maker. So those are kind of the, 3 or potentially 4 different steps.
Thank you. And I'll just reiterate what you've said a few times, Richard. We're really keen to hear your thinking on this. And obviously some of the chat around this has talked about the strengths and weaknesses of, where does that bar for registration sit? But please do get in contact with us with your thoughts on that. Also get in contact with MBIE. One of the key things we're hoping to do in this consultation period is get a lot of feedback to MBIE, whose proposal this is, from the profession, so they hear the weight of consideration across the profession. Now sorry, Richard, I didn't cut you off.
I was just noticing Peter's question there, which is how would this work when some people have moved away over time from a technical professional role into a people management or generalised role, but still wish to maintain registration licence? And so obviously this has personal relevance. I'm a mechanical engineer by profession. I haven't practiced as a mechanical engineer for some time because I've worked in basically senior executive leadership roles and now as a chief, now and previously as a chief executive. So in short, I would continue to be registered. So I would register, and I would choose to stay registered as an engineer. But if I was licensed, I would no longer be licensed, because unless you're practicing in the field, you can't stay current in the field, so therefore you wouldn't be able to hold a license. There would be a time, there'd be a certain period of time, exactly what I don't know, in which if you stopped doing licensed work, your license would be maintained and then you could refresh and go back. But after a certain length of time, you'd be considered no longer licensed. And licensing is probably going to have something like an annual practicing certificate. So if you move out of the licensing work, you'd probably, let that certificate lapse.
Thanks, Richard. Warren asked a good question about the Auckland Council Register and other registers that are around the country, and how might this proposal impact that? And I think we're hopeful this proposal actually addresses some of what we're seeing.
Yeah, our aim, if this works well, then hopefully councils will no longer have the need to have separate registers. Our view is probably that what they would look to do for any significant complex engineering work in a structural sense, they would look to work with licensed engineers. Where it was simple and straightforward stuff, they'd have an expectation to be a registered engineer.
Thanks, Richard. I'm just watching the time, and we've got a question for everyone online that we're quite interested to hear your feedback on, and that's around the level for registration. So I wonder, Leanne, if you wouldn't mind popping that question up. Thanks, Leanne. So this question asks, at what level do you think engineers should be required to be registered? After graduation and completing a professional course? So similarly, as Richard talked about the legal profession, that's what they do. After graduation, a few years experience in completing a professional course. So this just adds that a bit of experience. And then finally, the last option is around the chartership level. So currently where we're sitting right now. So I'll just give you a couple of minutes to get into that. All right, give you about 10 more seconds. This is interesting. This is quite a different response than we got last week, isn't it? A little bit more down into graduation and completing a professional course. So thank you for that. We're going to be keeping these results, and also we will be keeping the chat and the questions. Like Leanne mentioned earlier, we'll keep them and look to address your points as we go on. So if we haven't answered every bit of the questions that you've been asking, please know we'll take them on board and try and respond in different forums, and also feedback into the work that we're doing to submit. There's a couple of questions that have come up. We'll maybe spend about 5 more minutes answering questions, and then we'll close off. And again, thank you for joining us in this very early morning session. So someone mentioned failures and what had been happening 10 years ago to kind of start off this conversation following the CTV building collapse and that sort of thing, and the case for change. Obviously, the Royal Commission had talked about specific license categories for high risk work. This proposal is quite different and more encompassing. Do you want to talk about some of the evolution of your understanding of what happened in that 10 years?
Yeah, so it's important to note that the Royal Commission, which investigated the CTV building, basically found that the system for regulation of engineers was insufficient, that the certified professional engineer wasn't of high enough standard, and that there were the inability to stop people practicing as engineers was a major failing in the system. So in the course of that time, MB has looked at 3 different proposals, this being the third, to try and address the issues raised by the Royal Commission. We, as your representatives on the profession, have worked very closely to try and make these proposals as workable and as practical as possible prior to their release. And we're now pretty pleased with where MB have got to. There is the open question of where registration will occur. And I guess one of the questions which I think we have also reflected on is, would universal registration of engineers have helped in the case of a failure like CTV? And the answer is no, it wouldn't have stopped it occurring, but it would have meant the consequences afterwards would have been a lot more straightforward.
Thanks, Richard. There was a question about the cost to industry and to individuals, professionals. Can you talk about that again a bit?
Yeah, so we're doing work with ACE New Zealand, who are surveying a wide variety of firms basically to get an idea of what this might cost. While the cost for registration will be, I would guess, significant, we don't have any exact figures, but for the purposes of ACE's work, they're using $600 per person per year. When compared to the other costs that an engineering firm typically has, and given this is for 12 months, it's not going to result in a massive increase in cost relative to the cost of being a member of Engineering New Zealand, for example.
Thanks, Richard. There's a question about reassessment. Currently, CPN is every 6 years.
I'll just jump to a question Andrew's asked.
Okay.
Is that cost for registration or licensing? That's for registration. Licensing would be an additional cost on top and probably significantly more than registration. How big, we don't know yet. But it would be a bit like the difference between being a member of Engineering New Zealand and being a CPN. It's significantly more to be a CPN.
Thanks. So the next question is around reassessment, and currently there's reassessments for CPN chapter every 6 years. What's the thinking on this? I know MB's asking questions about this, particularly around licensing.
Yeah, so with licensing, there will be auditing and there will be reassessment. Exactly when, the proposal is silent on and is looking for feedback. I think it's going to have to be in somewhere between sort of the 5 and 10 year range. Whether it stays at 6 years, I don't know. Much less than 5 years, and you get into a serious resource issue. It is complicated enough for us to do it at a 6 year mark because you've got to find so many people who work in the profession who are willing to be involved in the assessment. And so with licensing, too frequent, and it's going to get very expensive and very resource intensive. Not frequent enough, and people could lose touch with the profession, get out of practice, get out of being in the state of the art. That'll be a problem.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. And I wonder if some of that work that the regulator does in defining individual licensing classes will take that into consideration. So under this particular licensing class, what is the time frame for reassessment or audit and that sort of thing. Sorry, I'm just reading Murray's question. The issue for me is how a professional course will cover all disciplines. Maybe I can speak to that a little bit, Richard. A professional course will look at things outside of technical skills. So it will look at, your professional abilities and the way engineers work in their day-to-day jobs. So, for example, the legal course that lawyers undertake, it looks at what does it mean to be a professional outside of your technical skill? So that's cross-discipline and is quite generic and broad, is our understanding. Obviously, a lot will still need to be worked through, and I'm sure as the process continues, we'll be looking at what other professions do and what happens in engineering outside of New Zealand as well. So, did you see any questions on there you want to answer? I've got one that I've seen pop up.
One is, how will the assessors used for licenses be appointed? What level of expertise? Again, that's something the regulator is going to have to work through. Essentially, you will need very experienced professionals to assess licensing, because they will need to be experts in their field with a reasonable number of years expertise. So when you're talking about level of expertise, it's always a little hard to quantify. But if I said a very high level of expertise would be the level you'd be pitching it at.
Yeah, there's a question about chartered members automatically being registered, and I think we've talked about that quite a bit, haven't we? Around who's automatically forms part of that register. Whether it's membership to international groups, or whether it's our current charter membership, or how that works. That still needs to be worked through. What MBIE's really focusing on is this structure and this framework working. And you can see in their consultation document, they've asked quite a lot of questions. And so they want that high level feedback, but then they're also starting to ask the questions that get into the detail of how you plan going forward. But what we're really trying to do right now, and to support you to do, is think really high level about, is this structure right? Is mandatory registration right? Is licensing right? Etc. Now we're very close to the end of our time, and I recognise there's still a few questions popping up. We'll look to answer those through our other processes. And I wonder, Leanne, if you would mind to put on our website links to our frequently asked questions, and to also the website information we have. Thank you, Leanne. Really appreciate that.
Cool. Okay. In terms of next steps, this is our final slide, and this is where we are asking you to do something for your profession, and that is to make a submission to MBIE. We have a simple way you can do this through our website. So if you go onto our website, you can basically click on the links, and that gives you the ability to make a submission to MBIE on this. We really encourage you to do that. We really want you to do that, because the more voices MBIE hears from the profession, the more likely it is going to take those views on board. We'll obviously be putting a comprehensive submission in, but if that is backed up by thousands of submissions by engineers in New Zealand, it's going to be much, much stronger. So that's what we're encouraging you to do. So first up, please make a submission to MBIE. The second thing is where our submission will be, and that needs to be in by Friday the 25th of June. And secondly, we are finalising our submission. So if you have any further thoughts, please email either myself or Jodie, or send it to the sort of inquiries@engineeringnz.org, and we will incorporate that in our submission. So just in terms of what happens after the submission process, so all the submissions come in on Friday the 25th of June. MBIE will then analyse the feedback it receives and report it to the Minister. The Minister will then take that report, and assuming in this case she likes it, she'll then take that to Cabinet to get Cabinet approval for it to go into a legislative process. And MBIE hopes to have this up and running, get it in legislation in by the end of this year, and therefore the legislation passed by the first half of next year, which I have to say from experience is quite ambitious timing, and there'll be a lot of other legislation, but it's fantastic that they are looking to do something. Once the legislation is passed, we then go into that transition period where everything is established and set up and people transfer through. People will need to get appointed to the regulatory board, etc., etc. So there will be a lot of work. But again, as I've said previously, this is the work of years rather than months. So it's not going to be, the click of a switch. This is going to be a systematic process over quite a few years.
Thanks, Richard.
So lastly, I just want to say thank you very much for your attention, and particularly appreciated the questions and the comments coming through. That was fantastic. In July and August, I'll be getting around to all the branches across New Zealand, so I look forward to meeting many of you there. Please keep in touch and please do make a submission. Kia ora, everyone.